Hi, everybody. We're here this week to continue our walk through the theorists discussed in Daniel Pal's book, Nine Theories of Religion. We've looked at Tyler and Fraser, and last week we looked at Sigmund Freud. This week we'll be looking at Émile Durkheim. So let's get right into it. Durkheim here is depicted with a couple of his best-known books, The Elementary Forms of the Religious Life, about which we'll be saying a good deal. That's certainly the book that'll be most important for us, of course, but also his book, Suicide, which I think was a really landmark study for reasons that I will share with you. I want to start off with just a note of some key contributions of Durkheim. This is something probably I should have done with Freud. I mean, who is this person? Before you know when they were born, you need to know why you should care. Durkheim established the social. The social. What does that mean? The very idea of social as an adjective that can precede most anything, both precede it grammatically, in the sense of coming before the noun, but also precede it conceptually and in reality. Everything emerges from the social, from what we share, not simply from our individual minds. This is a defining feature of his view. A couple of short quotations from Daniel Pal's. Social facts are more fundamental than individual ones. Society comes first. Community comes first. Groups come before individuals. Another, we must explain individuals in and through society. As we'll see at a couple of points throughout the lecture, this leads Durkheim to develop a view that's quite different from that of Tyler, for example, who focused on individual belief, the savage philosopher who considers, this and that feature of his experience. Durkheim thinks that this is, in fact, not how things happen, just descriptively, and develops this field, sociology, as a way of tracing and describing that. That's our second point. Just as much as Freud was at the beginning of psychology, Durkheim was at the beginning of sociology. He shares that title to some extent with Max Weber, whom we'll be looking at in a couple of weeks. But Durkheim took this notion of society and put it into a scientific context and did some of the most important founding work in that discipline. Also, like Freud, and Pals points this out helpfully, Durkheim was drawn back continuously to religious belief, religious behavior and belief. He thought that this was a fundamental illustration of the broader principles of his social thought, of his sociology, and we'll see why. Émile Durkheim, 1858 to 1917, as we've said, he's a French sociologist, influential in countless ways, especially for his theories of religion. His father was a rabbi, that is, a Jewish teacher. However, he himself, by a young age, was agnostic. He was not a religious person, we would perhaps say today. That's something you'll find that has been characteristic of all the thinkers we've looked at, Tyler, Fraser, Freud so far, but also those coming up, with a couple of notable exceptions that we will uncover. Important works of his from the 1890s include The Division of Labor, Rules of Sociological Method, and the book Suicide. These books established his reputation before he got his kind of big university position, which we'll say a bit about in a minute. We'll also say a bit about the content, of course, of those books. He was also founder of the L'Année Sociologique, an important academic journal throughout the whole 20th century that created a kind of school, a Durkheim school. The school doesn't mean, school with a principal, a school of thought. Durkheim shaped generations of thinkers who came after him, thinkers who, like him, prioritized the social over the individual. An important milestone in Durkheim's life is when he was granted a professorship of education and sociology, as it happens, at the University of Paris, at the Sorbonne. And we might say, well, why does that matter? Well, it does matter very much in France. When you have achieved that position, professor at the Sorbonne, it means that you are the trendsetter. You are the thought leader. You are the influencer in that space. Your work is going to be what sets the tone for pretty much everyone else. As it so happens, Durkheim was the only member of faculty at the Sorbonne, I understand, whose lectures all students needed to attend. So he had really wide influence, or at least the capacity to exert a wide influence on many students. Um, During this time, as Pals describes it very nicely and sadly, his experience was a mix of triumph and tragedy. Triumph, publication of his book, The Elementary Forms of the Religious Life, 1912. This was a defining work, established his reputation forever, beyond his reputation, established his continued deep influence on the culture. However, just a few years later, in 1916, his son was killed in combat in World War I, and this led him to despair. Apparently, had an effect on his health and led, it seems, to his early death at the age of just 59. That is early. Academics don't really get started till we're 60. So, we'll see how that goes. Some influences highlighted, again, by Pals. I think this is really helpful framing. I have an image here of a guy being ridden by two other guys. The guys riding represent the church and the aristocracy in France. This is a cartoon associated with the French Revolution. They are riding the workers in France who would rise up and bring about the French Revolution. This was one of two revolutions that Durkheim acknowledged and couldn't help but acknowledge. I mean, he's writing at the end of the 19th century, had exerted enormous influence, and he says a permanent influence, a permanent change in the patterns of life in Europe. On the next slide, we'll see some of the reasons why that was so. Before we move on, though, I want to note the first point on this slide, Auguste Comte. Auguste Comte has a claim to the title of first sociologist, although he did not himself own the label in the same way that Durkheim was made to do. Comte was an earlier thinker. As you can see, he died the year before Durkheim was born. But he, like Tyler and many other thinkers of the period, looked to the evolution of society. They believed that society was undergoing an evolution that I believe we've discussed previously, and maybe through Tyler, from religion through philosophy, ultimately to science. Leaving behind the earlier stages. I mean, they might be of historical interest or illustrations of earlier patterns of thought, but they're not claimants to truth. Durkheim adopted this same developmental evolutionary view, and whose work could in many ways be characterized as positivistic. Posit here, the positive doesn't mean happy. Posit means to posit, to put out. Google it. Posit. It's a verb. You put something forward, right, and you test it and you verify it. And if it is tested and verified and proves to be true, it's true, right? If not, it's not true. So positivism became a really important movement in 20th century thought, and Durkheim was kind of a forerunner of that, following upon Auguste Comte. Four trends identified by Pals as essential for Émile Durkheim's work. I've tried to kind of state these pithily. First, a contractual order replaces the traditional social system. What's the traditional social system? You live in a village. There are elders. There's maybe a priest or rabbi or imam or some kind of authoritative figure, your teachers, right? These people exist in a kind of hierarchy of authority, and you listen to them. You take them seriously. As that traditional social system came apart, especially in the Industrial Revolution, people were led to form new ways of relating to one another. And one of the important ways in which they did so was the formation of contracts. So I'm going to listen to you, heed your view or your, needs, because we are contractually obligated to each other. We could even say that to a certain degree here, right? I am contractually obligated to the school. You have entered into a kind of contractual relationship with me. You're supposed to do certain things, or I'll, give you a low grade. We could say that that is mixed with the idea that I am in the role of professor, and professor has a certain kind of traditional social value or prestige or something like that. So you might listen to me because I'm a professor, but you might also listen to me just because I'm the guy giving you the grade, right? And that latter view would be a contractual understanding of our relationship. A second trend, desire for happiness in this life, takes precedence over a belief in heaven or hell. So as that theological horizon receded throughout the period of the 19th century, people began to worry less about whether they were, as it were, going to heaven or hell, and more about achieving social improvements in this life. Third, a shift to democracy leaves people with less guidance. All those traditional social people I was referring to early, priests, rabbis, imams, teachers, and so forth, um, if if you live in a truly horizontal society, a horizontal society. Everybody is a citizen. During the French Revolution, people will be referred to as citoyen, and then your surname, right? So citizen so and so. We have this in Citizen Kane, right? Everybody is a citizen. Everybody is equal as a citizen. Doesn't matter if you have a certain position, you're a professor, whatever it is. And of course, we continue to uphold that in important ways. But Durkheim thinks that this has an upside, which we'll probably be aware of, equality. It also has a downside, as people are less certain who to turn to for guidance. Finally, a trend of greater risk. In this new society, this open, mobile society, right? On the one hand, you have a greater chance for self-realization. Back in that village, not a lot of chances for self-realization. You kind of know who you are, you kind of know what you're going to do, and you go ahead and do that. However, in this modern society, so we're looking here at the problem of the modern world, the problem of modernity. In this modern society that is democratic, focused on worldly happiness, based on contracts, things we just saw, there's also a possibility for feeling really lonely, feeling alienated, right? You don't have all that warm village celebrations and such things to kind of structure your experience. Durkheim is the thinker of the social. We've said that already. Importantly, society, when Durkheim began to write, and this is one reason why his work was so controversial, society means what it still means kind of today in a newspaper sense, the society pages, right? High society, upper class, cultured, right? Art, opera, this kind of thing. Um, when Durkheim started writing, that's what society meant. I'm gonna come out into society, right? So a woman at the time would have a ball or a celebration. That's her coming out into society. Durkheim changes this. It's not upper class. It's upper class. It's middle class. It's lower class. It's all everybody. Everybody together collectively makes up society. He lays down, according to Pals here, two basic principles. These are things to keep in mind. Number one, the nature of society is the most suitable and promising subject for systematic investigation, especially at the present moment in history. So rather than thinking about, the individual, what would you say, individual experience, we've used the term phenomenology, right? I'm studying how things appear to me. For Durkheim, has a certain interest. But in the 20th century, right, in the modern world, if you want to understand what's going on, you got to understand networks. You got to understand relations between people and how those networks actually precede those individual decisions. Number two, that all social facts should be investigated by purely objective purely objective scientific methods. I was distracted by thinking of how important this notion of social facts is. Let's talk about that for a minute. So a fact is a state of affairs, right? Comes from the Latin factum, right? A given, something that is just there. We have some debates today about, facts. that sort of thing. But for Durkheim, when you talk about society, it's not just a matter of, well, I think this and you think that, and there are different opinions, right? No, for him, society is composed of social facts, you know, given states of affairs that are true of certain groups of people. You can identify those, and we call them statistics, right? You use statistics. This is what social scientists do. You identify the facts and then you explain them. You conduct experiments or you gather further data and you analyze it. So for Durkheim, studying society is not a subjective, this is how it seems to me kind of point of view. Alexis de Tocqueville, an earlier French writer, very important figure, wrote the book Democracy in America in 2 volumes back in the 1830s, I believe it was. He took a more essayistic approach. Essay means here to attempt, right? So he's kind of sharing his thoughts and impressions, drawing some conclusions. Durkheim says, no, 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 that's not enough. I don't want to just give you my impressions. I'm going to give you, facts, and then I'm going to explain those facts scientifically. That's sociology. As mentioned before, for Durkheim, he's kind of situating himself in relation to other thinkers, right? Number one, it's not true that we started as pure individuals in this state of nature, right? If you're familiar with the thought of John Locke or some earlier political writers, right? That they imagined that there were all these individuals, and then one day they chose, in this kind of thought experiment of the social contract, to come together and form a society, right? And that's the social contract. Durkheim says no, contracts cannot explain how societies came to be. Each of us is born into a language, into a culture, into a certain sense of history, and a system of values, relationships. All of those things come to us before we even are us. We become who we are through those things, social things. So the very idea of a social contract in Durkheim's view is inadequate. It doesn't explain actually how things work for us. In fact, as an example of this, point number 2, public property, he thinks, came before private property, right? The idea that the clan, to use a word that he sometimes uses in the um, elementary forms of the religious life, the clan owned certain things, right? It is public property. And then from there, that individual kind of version of that developed. Okay, I'm going to have this property just for myself, right? In this, he's different from certain other influential thinkers before him. We've already talked a bit about social facts, very important notion. Without social facts, you can't have a science, right? So you need social facts. He thinks that you can study modern societies in a scientific way and demonstrates this through his book, Suicide, 1897. What that book finds, famously, controversially, is that if you simply gather the facts, what are the facts? What are the rates of suicide in various European countries, different regions of these countries? What did he find? Protestant countries, predominantly Protestant Christians, had higher rates of suicide than Catholic countries, predominantly Roman Catholic. Why? He has an explanation for that. Pardon me. Durkheim has an explanation for that. That's because Protestants tend to be more individualistic than Catholics, right? So Catholics have the sense that there's a priest, and the priest is somehow mediating, between themselves and the divine God. Complex issue. Protestants, not as much. It's more the individual, alone on his or her own before God. It's kind of Martin Luther's "Here I stand, and I can do no other. Here I stand," right? And there are lots of criticisms in both directions about that between Protestants and Catholics. You may have heard sometimes they don't get along, but what Durkheim discovers is that you don't have to get into the theology of it. You don't have to, look at individual psychology even. You can just see what kinds of claims are made by each of these traditions. You can measure an effect in society of those claims. This was regarded at the time as a really remarkable finding, and something that made his reputation. 5 years later, he was a professor at the Sorbonne. Let's look at elementary forms, the elementary forms of the religious life. This, as we've said, is kind of a defining work for Durkheim, certainly his defining work for our purposes. What's he doing here? It's exactly what it says in the title. He's looking for the basic elements, periodic table, chemistry. He wants to know, what's a religion made of? What's it composed of? What makes it tick, right? In this, he's doing the same thing that Tyler and Fraser were doing in certain ways, but he's coming to a slightly different conclusion, and the difference is significant. So he starts from a distinction that we are going to see quite a lot in future theorists, especially Mircea Eliade, whom we'll look at in a few weeks. He starts from the distinction between the sacred and the profane. Best way to approach this is probably just through a brief quotation from Daniel Paus's book, which I will read now. It's on the slide. Sacred things, Paus writes, are always set apart as superior, powerful, forbidden to normal contract, and deserving of great respect. Profane things are the opposite. They belong to the ordinary, uneventful, and practical routine of everyday life. We've said before that the term the holy, doesn't mean virtuous. We tend to mean it means nice, right? Or, I don't know, proper. Right? It's not what it means. It means set apart. It means uninfluenced by, right? Or unswayed by the waves of our culture, of the world, right? So even if the whole world is going crazy, if a person has holiness, he or she is able to, as it were, just be a kind of fixed point in that storm. That is very much what Durkheim believes the sacred means, right? So sacred things are set apart. You can't just hang out with them. You don't wear your t-shirt and shorts when you go to see the sacred things. Sacred things are defining of us, which is what we're getting to, right? They make our community what it is. They're public, right? They're not just something I happen to like privately. They're something that all of us, insofar as there is an us at all, like, right? Or if we don't like it anyway, it has a certain, it exerts a certain power over us. By contrast, are profane things. Here we're talking about like your toothbrush, right? Or I don't know, a pair of shoes, something like that. Everyday things. They're not bad. We say profanities. Don't use profanity, right? You say bad words. Profanities profane doesn't mean bad, just like holy doesn't mean virtuous. Profane just means everyday, right? It's the same way when we call someone mean. We say, you're mean, right? Well, what does that mean? Well, the word mean means average, right? So if you're being mean, it means that you're being just absolutely average. You're not being generous. You're not being kind, right? You're just behaving in a totally predictable kind of selfish way, right? Same thing here with the word profane. Doesn't mean bad. It just means private, local, practical use. This leads him into his definition of religion, which we have here quoted from Durkheim. Religion is a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things, that is to say, things set apart and forbidden. We've already talked a bit about what sacred things are, so we're saying that there are beliefs and practices relative to, they are about those sacred things. We're going to look at some examples of sacred things in just a moment, right? So you got these sacred things, they're important. Everybody regards them as important, even if they don't like them or whatever. They have power. Okay, you're going to do some practices. You're going to form some beliefs around those things, right? As a community, and doing that, the practices and the beliefs, right? That's going to unite people together collectively into a moral community. And here he calls this a church, right? So he's thinking especially of the European case. We don't need to go with church or ecclesia. Society or community does just as well, although in a religious context, we will call them. There are lots of words for it. Ummah in Islam, for example, means the community of believers. The community is formed around these sacred things. That's what makes it what it is, right? In this way, last point on the slide, for Durkheim, religion does not replace magic, right? We saw that in Tyler and Fraser. That was kind of a defining thing, right? So first came magic, and then we end up with religion, right? It kind of develops into religion. For Durkheim, category mistake. That is a category mistake because magic does not become religion. Magic is like the opposite of religion, right? So if I have a thing, I'm sick, and I want to be healed from my sickness, right? So I'm going to go to a magician. I'm going to go to some kind of, I don't know, do we still use the term witch doctor? Well, whatever that was, right? I'm going to go to some person who can do something good for me, and I'm going to say, hey, would you please fix my private personal concern, namely my illness? And that person might say yes, and perhaps they might do it, right? That's magic. Religion is not private in that way. Religion is public. Religion is shared, right? Religion is about sacred things that are outside of myself. They come prior to my individual consciousness, right? These are things that shape our community. So magic and religion are different. Magic is private, religion is public. Totemism. We're back to totemism. We talked about this a little bit in discussion of E.B. Tyler's work earlier on. So Durkheim is looking for an example, a real existing, observable today example of the simplest civilization he can find. Simplest, right? So he has this evolutionary idea. We talked about Comte earlier on, right? So he thinks that societies evolve and develop. So there are societies that are more primitive, like Tyler's book, Primitive Culture, and there are societies that are more advanced, like France in 1902. He thinks that the most truly simple civilization in existence in late 19th century, early 20th, is in Australia, Aboriginal cultures in Australia, and specifically Australian tribal religions. Durkheim gathers data, social facts about this culture, and comes to a conclusion concerning the totem. Got some totems on the screen here, right? We talked about this with Tyler. Animals, plants represent the clan. The totem in Pals here is supremely sacred and communicates its sacred character to all around it. So if you are connected with this totem, if you participate in the ritual, if you have these beliefs, if you structure your life in some way around this totem, your intentionality, how you're approaching things, that will convey to you, communicate to you, its sacred character. You yourself will be connected with the sacred. You'll be connected with the community. Lots of benefits to that. This is, Pals writes here, the simplest, most basic, and original form of religion. All other forms can only grow out of it. So again, evolutionary view, he finds something simple, and from that, he thinks, come things that are more complex, religious traditions that are more complex. He's not interested only, however, in, as Tyler was, the case of the totem, right? Because for Tyler, this was like primitive cultures. This was old stuff, right? This isn't modern society. I mean, it kind of lingers like a survival into modern society. But modern societies are scientific. We're rational. We're individualists, right? Not for Durkheim. He thinks that this totemic principle, that is the basic idea connected with the worship or the veneration of a totem, continues today completely, right? This is why he thinks religion is kind of inevitable. Maybe not Christianity, Buddhism, Judaism, particular traditions, but there is a kind of religious character to society itself, even modern society. Passage from Pals, very helpful. Behind the totem, Pals writes, is an impersonal force that possesses enormous power, both physical and moral, over the life of the clan. People respect it. They feel a moral obligation to observe its ceremonies. And through it, they feel tightly bound to each other in deep and abiding loyalty. Step one, bunch of people living in the same area, interacting with each other. Step two, emergence of a totem, a sacred object that comes to represent those people to themselves, right? And they begin to worship, to venerate this. And in venerating the object, they're in fact honoring and strengthening their own group, the clan, right? Step three, that totem turns into a god, right? That's our last point on the slide here. Belief in gods grows out of this principle. So it's not that people thought up the idea of a god, it's that people formed a community, began to identify with that community, and then projected that idea of itself into the kind of abstract space to become a god, something transcendent that even goes beyond the community. This is Durkheim's picture of religion. Some totems. These are both mentioned by pals. We have here Old Glory, a certain song. Of course, we're talking about the Stars and Stripes. We're talking about the American flag. And of course, Uncle Sam, right? So here we have images that, however you feel about them, represent these United States of ours, right? Or certainly have done in the past, and for many still do today. When you see these things, if you trample on the flag, if you insult or mock Uncle Sam, right? This is seen as unpatriotic, right? You hate America, something like this. Why are feelings so strong about some picture, right? It's because it's not a picture. It's not about a picture. No one cares about the picture of Uncle Sam. They care about the country, right? America. And if you're dishonoring these symbols, you are in effect dishonoring the country and thus dishonoring anyone who honors it. How do these totems emerge in the first place? Well, it comes from ritual, from events, from experiences that people have. Durkheim, pals, writes, Durkheim vividly describes the sentiments that bubble up in the excitement of group ceremonies. They are filled with energy, enthusiasm, joy, selfless commitment, and complete security. It is in the midst of these effervescent social environments and out of this effervescence itself that the religious idea seems to be born. At such moments, the profane is left behind, only the sacred exists. Remember, the sacred does not mean God coming down to us, right? The sacred is the group. The sacred is the symbol that, the symbols, network of symbols perhaps, that unite the group, that convince them that they're together, that something is happening. Think of any concert you've gone to, right? Things happen there, like in the image here. People at the concert, they forget their individual concerns, their car, whatever it is, right? They enter into this effervescent, it means like a kind of glow, right? There's this power about this experience. And that experience leads them to be more fully devoted to those symbols, to identify with them, right? To say, I'm a fan, right? We say, I'm a fan of this or that. I am a fanatic about this or that, right? It means I move beyond what is like rational individual conduct, right? I'm a fanatic for that team, right? I go crazy for them. This means that you lose your individual identity and you do crazy things, right? You interact with others in this way that you would not do in an everyday kind of context. This is really interesting. So I've broken my own rule, which is not to put long quotations on slides, because I just really want to talk about this one with you really briefly. The soul as social. Oh, think about this, right? So I teach philosophy and religion. The idea of body and spirit, body and soul, kind of the problem of the relationship between these things. It's something that kind of comes up from time to time. What does Pal say about this? Really nice, pithy paragraph describing Durkheim's view. Durkheim develops, Pal's writes, a social idea of the soul and considers the age-old religious and philosophical problem of its relation to the body. If the soul is, and here's our claim, right? If the soul is, in effect, the clan group idealized and implanted within the self, then in that capacity, its task of the soul, is to represent society's demands and ideals to the individual. We continue, bold sentence. The soul is the conscience of the self, the voice of the clan within, informing each of his or her personal obligation to the group. Pause there for a moment, right? We think of the soul as a kind of like ghosty, floaty thing, right? And it's like it comes into us when we're born, goes out when we're, it's things like this. Not at all. Durkheim is saying all that, spirit, matter stuff, forget about it, right? There's nothing there. The term soul simply corresponds to our internalizations of the expectations of the group. Public things, higher things, sacred things, right? Things that bind us together, things that are good because they hold us together as a group, promoting our safety and prosperity, right? By contrast with this is, we continue, the body, on the other hand, naturally asserts its own self-centered desires, which can and often do clash sharply with the constraints of social life. No wonder then that religion has always been suspicious of the desires of the flesh. Exclamation point. Pretty rare to have an exclamation point in an academic text. They satisfy the individual and are profane. Religion asserts the claims of the social and is therefore sacred. Right? So if I am satisfying the needs, desires, drives of my body, right? Fine. That's a personal thing. That's a private thing, right? And you might say, if you're dealing, let's say you're dealing with someone in a bureaucratic context, you're at the DMV, you're at the bank, you're interacting with somebody in a kind of formal, public way. If the person's having a bad day and they're like, I'm having a bad day, so I don't care about your case, right? You're going to say, don't make this about you, right? Just because you're having a bad day personally doesn't mean that you get to not do your job, right? Which is to work with me in this public setting. So we have an intuitive sense that the private, the personal, has no right to encroach upon the good of the group in some way, right? Or some of us do, right? I mean, anyway, this is one of the defining tensions, right? Does the personal or individual have a right to encroach on the needs of the group? What Durkheim is saying is that this tension describes the distinction between body and soul, the distinction between the flesh and the spirit, all of these things that we thought they were metaphysical things. We thought this was like spiritual or something. No, it's social. Everything is social. Talking about rituals. So how do we convince ourselves of the importance of the sacred, right? How does this become important? Well, in a way, we don't convince ourselves at all. We are convinced by others, by our clan, right? We ritually perform our devotion to the totem. Here we have an image from Australian Aboriginal culture, a ritual that is occurring. Durkheim talks about three different rituals: the negative, the positive, and the piacular, a word that you've perhaps never heard and I had not ever heard before I read Daniel Pels's chapter. The negative, right? Sometimes we do stuff to protect and preserve the sacred, right? So there are certain taboos, prohibitions. Think about like blue laws in New England, right? You can't buy alcohol after a certain hour. You can't buy it on Sunday, right? You're not supposed to schedule things or do things on Sunday. Sunday is a day of rest. It's pretty secularized at this point. We're not thinking of it in biblical terms, most of us, right? Although some of us are. But the very idea that there's a day that is set apart from other days and is a day when people should rest, is an example of a negative ritual from Durkheim's point of view. Positive ritual is when we come together to celebrate, to affirm, to experience this sacred thing. So an example in a religious context would be the Mass in the Catholic tradition, or the liturgy in any Christian tradition. The Eucharist, people come together literally around the body of Christ in Christian theological understanding, right? You experience this real presence of Jesus Christ through the ritual, And that is something that affirms your belonging to the group and deepens your commitment to the, the, the sacred that is represented. And finally, the piacular, something goes wrong. Right? There's a death, thus a kind of shift in the community. There's a tragedy. There's an act of violence. Something happens. We have to do something to mark that. Why? Why do we have to do that, right? Durkheim says we're managing the sacred, the profane, the identity of our society, right? I mean, we know when there's a shooting, there's some kind of awful event. We say thoughts and prayers. We're gonna a period of national mourning, right? We're going to reflect on things, try and do things differently. That set of practices, those things we do and say, would be for Durkheim an example of a piacular, right? So you either protect the sacred with these taboos, you celebrate and deepen the sacred through the positive rituals, and you kind of heal and fix the sacred with piacular rituals. Ooh, it's a positive ritual, right? Think about the last time you went to a 4th of July fireworks display. Everybody's there. You got your lawn chairs. Maybe some people have some adult beverages. You're watching the fireworks. And, it's been kind of a rough few years in America, but gosh darn it, this is America, right? So that's a positive ritual. You're renewing your commitment to these United States. Last couple slides, friends. Daniel Pals concludes his analysis, as he so often does, with a helpful set of a few points to highlight from Durkheim's presentation. Number one, society and religion. Religion is something eminently social, right? It's not a conclusion that we come to in the loneliness of our heart, right? We are born into it. Even if you don't call it Christianity, Buddhism, Judaism, whatever, Islam, you're born into a community. That community is constituted by sacred things. So sorry, you got religion everywhere. That's the thing with Durkheim. You can find religion almost everywhere. Baseball. Baseball's a religion, right? Concerts, religion. Right? So scholars of religion love this because it gives us a whole bunch of stuff to work with. But what we're saying is you can identify that kind of group dynamic in lots of different situations, even ones that you might think are just secular. Scientific method. Durkheim's a little more careful than Tyler and Fraser. Remember we talked about how they're kind of making some tenuous comparisons. Not Durkheim. Durkheim's looking at only one society, so there's no kind of strange reaches that he has to make across, Russia and Africa and Native American cultures and such things. Third, his emphasis on ritual, on practice, right? So just like with the first one, he's not interested in what I think in my head. He's interested in who I am in my social group. The same thing here. Ritual comes before belief. You don't decide, gosh, I've read a few books and you know what? I think I believe God exists. Now I'm going to go to church and celebrate my belief that God exists. As my grandfather would say, you got it back asswards, right? That's not how it works. You start with ritual. You're born. You don't even have object perception. You don't know your name. You don't know who or where you are, but you're brought to church, or you're brought to the 4th of July, or you're brought to your family's Thanksgiving dinner, whatever it is, right? You experience this network of meaningful relationships. Oh, that's grandpa, oh, that's Aunt Kathy, or whoever it is. And you're conditioned to respect those relationships and to adopt the values of the group. Those are rituals, my friends, right? They may not be happening in a religious building, but they are rituals nonetheless. That comes before belief. And finally, this idea of functional explanation. Religion is explained by Durkheim in terms of what it accomplishes, what it does, right? Not in terms of what it believes or thinks it is doing. More about that on the next slide, which will also be our last slide. Critique, a few things. Number one, Durkheim has a hammer and everything's a nail, right? He says, I'm going to look for the sacred and the profane. Guess what he finds? The sacred and the profane. Finds it everywhere, right? Is this circular? In logic, the term circular means that you're actually assuming what you're setting out to prove in your conclusion. What it means is not going to be a very productive analysis. You're not going to be gaining any really new knowledge. You're just going to be applying something that you already started with to different cases. Now, maybe that's kind of interesting illustration of it, but it's not teaching you anything new. This is one criticism that is made of Durkheim's work, that he assumes what he tries to prove. Number two, evidence. I mean, Durkheim's working with the best sources he's got, but how good are those sources actually, right? If his data, this is a social facts man, right? If his data is wrong, it could just be wrong, right? Actually, a lot of people have thought it kind of was off a bit, his account of Aboriginal Australian society. If his data is off, well, guess what? He's a scientist. His whole experiment is off. His whole theory is off. So, the particulars of his theory are vulnerable in that way. Although I would say the kind of arching vision of the theory, right? The kind of, how would we put it? The idea that the social is over everything and under everything, that everything is social. I mean, that remains. But in terms of how he proves it with his data, you can lose that. Finally, reductionism. Okay, so religion helps us come together as a community. Guess what? You knew that before this lecture started, and so do I. Something religion does. Why is Durkheim interesting? Because his claim is much more provocative than that. He's not just saying that religion helps us build community. Yeah. He's saying that that's all that religion is. Even the soul, even God, right? All these things that we think are greater than ourselves, right? Not the case. All of those things are ourselves, right? God, the soul, high ideals, principles, all of that is just an expression of what is sacred to the group and makes the group, in fact, what it is. Friends, thank you very much for your attention. I do hope that you've learned something about Émile Durkheim. It has been a pleasure getting to speak with you about him today. Next week, Karl Marx.